first session, we'll be looking at what is infrastructure, what are its defining characteristics, what is the characteristics of infrastructure, and what are the primary functions of the entities that you're looking at. Now, the entities you're looking at, I'm going to just introduce them high level in this session so that you've got a vague idea what they are. And when we come to the final two sessions tomorrow afternoon, we will go in a bit more detail as to what these entities are all about, because by then you should have understood the context of it all. So the first thing we've got to start with is, what is infrastructure? Now, historically, when I started in the industry, I've been in the industry for 45 years now. When I started, when you spoke about infrastructure, you thought about civil engineering. And over time, it's come to understand it embraces buildings as well as information tech, and communication technology.
Sorry.
So it's evolved over time. So when you had
Sorry, yeah, I just want to, that light again, just if you can just move it away. Yeah, it's blocking our view.
Okay, so when we had legislation like the Construction Industry Development Board legislation was put in somewhere around about 2000, at that stage, people were still regarding infrastructure just as civil engineering. So if you look at the definition of construction industry, it's actually interesting because it embraces everything. It basically says the Act defines construction industry as the broad conglomeration of industries and sectors which add value in the creation and maintenance of fixed assets within the built environment. So if you think about fixed assets in the built environment, that is what infrastructure is all about. And when we're talking about the conglomeration of industries, we're talking about the consultants, the material sectors, the service providers, the contractors. It's not just about construction works and contractors. It's all embracing. The Council for the Built Environment Act defines the built environment in such a way that it includes all engineering disciplines. And that's where the whole communication and information technology installations falls within that as well. The Government Immovable Asset Act, because remember, every time an act comes out, you define terms in the context of the act. And that act was also talking about land as an asset. So immovable assets would be our infrastructure and land. If we now go to the more modern acts that came out, we have the Infrastructure Development Act of 2014, which came out. And that act defines infrastructure as installations, structures, facilities, systems, services, or processes relating to matters put out in a schedule. So instead of trying to define it, because it's quite a difficult concept to define, they then listed the items or the fields that it would be involved in. And if you scan your eye down that, you'll see it's both the social infrastructure, the infrastructure that supports the life of citizens, that would be the hospitals, schools, all of those. And then you've also got the economic infrastructure, which is going to be the ports, the harbors, how we communicate, how we get our goods to market, and how we move around. So all of that is all embracing. So when we talk about infrastructure, it's very broad. The older acts might have called it something else, but I think we all have an understanding of what infrastructure is. Now, if I take it to the Public Procurement Act, which is the most recent, that was signed into law in earlier in the year, that defines infrastructure as the physical facilities or structures and systems, including digital analog communication systems, that are required to provide services to the public directly or indirectly. So when we talk about infrastructure, it's very broad, and don't get hung up by its usage in one particular act. We used to just have the Department of Public Works, and then it was changed to Works and Infrastructure. Now, I think just in terms of understanding infrastructure and understanding assets, we have to always look at a system, because we have network infrastructure that on its own, each piece makes no sense. When it's put into a system, it then acts as it can deliver a service. So if we look at our water, for example, you'll see in this diagram, we're starting off with a dam. We have a water treatment works. We have bulk water pipelines. We have reservoirs connecting things all the way down into the sewer system, all the way back to the river. So when we think about infrastructure, always think about the networks and the interactions that it has. Now, in terms of employment characteristics, and I think that that is very important to understand the sort of where we can locate it as an enabler in society, because one of the things that government doesn't do is build infrastructure for the sake of infrastructure. Government is not a property developer. It has a purpose, and I think we need to understand some of the attributes of it. So construction has the highest output multiplier and the highest employment multiplier for every R1 of activity in construction output, and it almost doubles, and the economy creates 3.4 unskilled and 1.5 skilled jobs. What I've taken here is what the economists would produce, and they would talk about your domestic output multiplier, your employment multiplier, and you notice that infrastructure allows a lot of unskilled people into the market, and that's where it generates a lot of jobs. So this is why it is an area that's a very important thing from a government position in generating jobs, is to put money into infrastructure and invest in infrastructure. Now, the problem that we have in South Africa with just some of the issues, and I'm not going to delve into a blame game or anything else like this, I'm just putting the facts before us that we can see with some of the areas of where there are problems. When I take you through some of the systems and some of the practices that I'll be talking about, more of the best practices, you'll start seeing the gaps and where some of the reasons become quite obvious. Now, the National Development Plan which was published in 2012, viewed infrastructure as follows. It saw that public infrastructure would enable the economy to grow faster, become more productive and competitive, that is the economic side of it. It would be lower costs of doing business, creates jobs for low-skilled people, promotes spatial inclusivity, which was a very important part from our apartheid past in having population groups so segregated that when we do our new infrastructure, we're going to be more inclusive in terms of our population. Contributes to the elimination of poverty, reduction of unemployment and inequality, and provides opportunities for BEE. So that really summarizes in an extent of what the potential of the industry is. But poorly planned, procured, delivered, operated and managed infrastructure can be an impediment rather than an enabler of economic growth. It can undermine BEE, result in an increase in employment and inequality. For example, our water shortages, we're now starting to see where infrastructures run down and not functioning correctly. It becomes a drain on the economy rather than an enabler. And if you want an example of a classic example of what can go wrong at a large scale, was the whole Eskom's Medupi and Kusile power stations. It failed to resolve the electricity problems that we had, firstly. Secondly, it put a cap on economic growth and hence employment creation, because we had to pay the bailout of the massive escalations in cost to keep Eskom going. And it brought Eskom to the brink of bankruptcy, and it put our sovereign balance sheet at risk. So there you can see, if things are done badly, infrastructure can really get things wrong. If it works, it really is something that's an enabler to the economy. So if we just think about the whole philosophy, if we invest in economic infrastructure, it will occur in respect of where you've got a demand. So if you've got a demand, or in reaction to demand for capacity, so we need to get our goods exported through the ports. We need to have roads. We need, if you think of Free State at the moment with farmers trying to get produce to markets, all of those things is the reasons why we need infrastructure. When it happens, it basically has three impacts. The first is going to be the initial growth in demand for people, equipment, materials. So when you're doing your construction or you're doing your maintenance, there is a huge injection of employment creation and money gets spread around the economy. When you've got, and that will take as long as it is to create the asset, and then we've got the demand for of resources over the lifespan of the assets to maintain and operate it. Now look, a rule of thumb, and it can be quite varying, but something like 20 to 30% of the costs would be of the lifespan of infrastructure would be typically representative of the construction cost. The other 70 to 80% is the maintenance as well as the operational costs. So when we invest in infrastructure, we've got to think about the long term. Can we afford it over time? Can we maintain it? Because otherwise we're going to have a reversal of its benefit to society. And the last is a productivity impact in the overall economy, either producing more or producing it better, or more efficient infrastructure, or simply the availability of capacity. So by building the infrastructure, it creates connectivity with the outside world, creates activities with markets, supports economic activity. So we've really got, during construction, during its life, and the purpose it serves, all adds to what we need. However, expenditure on infrastructure will not necessarily lead to economic growth. If we invest in the wrong infrastructure, it's not going to have the effect. We might have the effect of short-term employment, but we're not getting the effects of improved productivity. So infrastructure which provides improvements and efficiencies in services, production of export capabilities, and which is delivered and maintained in a manner which minimizes waste of materials, time, and effort to generate the maximum possible value, is likely to contribute to economic growth. So we've got to be careful. It's not just a formula. If we invest in infrastructure, we're going to get all the benefits from it. We've got to think carefully about how we invest, and we've also got to make sure that it is constructed and maintained efficiently. I'm now going to take you through a couple of slides on industry performance. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but just to give you the picture. A lot of this comes from the research that was done with the National Planning Commission, which looked at, fairly recently, looked at progress made towards the achievement of the National Development Plan, and to try and understand what course correction needed to be done. So if you looked at your National Development Plan, we wanted gross fixed capital formation to 30% of GDP by 2030. That was the target. The idea that 10% of that would come from government and 20% from the private sector. The plan also envisaged that public infrastructure would be 10% of GDP, private funding to be sourced for some of these investments, and grow the construction sector. Now, the reality is when you do a reality check of where we are, and I'm just talking at a macro level, just to give you some idea on how this industry performs, PPPs have not resulted in sufficient scale of private sector investment in public infrastructure. The figures we had when this was produced in about 2020 was 2% of expenditure. If we looked at other countries, such as like the UK, the figure's probably closer to 50%. So I'm purely just saying we have not really been able to engage with the private sector. That was one of the findings that came out. And obviously, a lot of plans are on afoot to try and rectify that. I've got a graph at the bottom here, is when you have under expenditure or you have lowering of expenditure, can you see the figures for the trend in civil engineering? From 2014 to 2019, we lost 45% of the labor force, purely with the downturn. And the figures I'm showing you are all prior to COVID. So don't think COVID was in the mix that was causing some of this concern. So let's just look at what happened prior to COVID. What we've got is, you will see the plot is over time, and we've got percent of GDP. We had a target of 10%. When we did the 2010 World Cup, we had a lot of infrastructure that was not just related to the Cup. It was getting our pipelines, getting our oil up, getting our airports upgraded. There were a hell of a lot of upgrading going. We only got to 8%. If you look at the whole period from 1999 to 2018, we've only been sitting somewhere around just below 6% on average. So we're a long way off our targets. Part of the problem you'll see as well is the inability, I'll show you in the next slide, the inability of government to spend has been a huge problem. Sorry, I did cut that slide out. One of the problems has been that we've had this magical 300, 400 billion or whatever it is, but if you look over the years, government hasn't spent its budgets, particularly municipalities, some of the state-owned enterprises. So despite having the budget, it's not a budget problem, it's a delivery problem that we are sitting with. And I think that's what I wanted to really communicate to you. Everyone with me? Okay. Now, I wanted to take you through risk, because people don't understand the industry. The construction industry is all about risk. If you're risk averse, you shouldn't get involved in the industry. It's like, I have an old contractor friend of mine who's now retired. He said he had friends that said to him, and by the way, he ran some of the major construction companies and built some of the major projects in this country. He had a friend that said to him, don't you want to go gambling with us this weekend? He said, no, I'm a contractor. I gamble 24/7. And we laugh like that, but we're actually trading in risk. So let me try and take you through this, because this is such an important concept. So many people don't understand it. So what are the fundamental risks that you're looking at in construction? Let's take it down to the simplest level. The client fails to achieve project value, which is the anticipated project outcomes at the time that a decision was taken to proceed with the project. How many projects have we got that have been unsuccessful? Huge cost overruns, and I'm not going to go into naming of projects, but that's one of the risks, that you expect this outcome and you didn't achieve it. And I think we have a lot of reports around the country around that. If we look at from the contractor's point of view or the supplier, he might make a loss. in executing a contract or suffer reputational damage. So both parties are at risk. So I said to you, we trade in risk, so let's try and understand this. Let me give you the generic sources of risk. In infrastructure projects, you have commercial and legal relationships because we have two parties. The one party wants the infrastructure. The other party is saying, I will provide the infrastructure, but I want to make a profit. Now, there's nothing wrong with a profit because the profit gets invested back in the business and allows businesses to grow. And I think if we understand it from that position, you have two different objectives. Government wants the infrastructure, private sector wants the profit. Otherwise, why would they do it? Okay? So we first of all got those relationships to sort out. We've then got economic circumstances, price adjustment for inflation. We have inflation going up all the time. How do you forecast that? We've seen some dramatic increases in certain commodities. Steel prices went through the roof around the 2010 World Cup stadiums. You couldn't get steel, shortages, all of those kind of things. We have human behavior. How do you price for the behavior of the client if you were a contractor? You've got to think about all of these things. How are we going to get the relationships going? Because remember, with these sites, you have a particular site. What construction is actually manufacturing a product on a site. So you've got different teams, different combinations of clients, different players. All of those things have to be managed. So there's risk attached to that. There's natural events. What happens if we have an earthquake? What happens if we have flooding? Who bears the cost of that? The weather. If you think about the heat waves we've had, I've lived in Johannesburg all my life, and it's only been in the last sort of decade that one has had to think about air conditioning and all of those things because we've had rapid increase in temperature. So you have all of these factors to contend with. Inherent site conditions. You know, we're dealing with ground. I remember, look, I'm an engineer, and I can remember being in first year engineering, and people were telling us about soil properties. It's, you know, assuming it was elastic, homogenic, all of these kind of properties. And I remember someone stood up and said, Prof, are we still talking about soil? Because soil isn't like that. We can't see what's happening underground. You can put a borehole here, and you can have a borehole there, and you can have a massive change in geology in between. We don't know where services are in the ground, all the old services. All of those risks are there. And so I can go on. Political circumstances. We talk about the construction mafia. How do you deal with those? Or community unrest, or whether they're legitimate or illegitimate, or whatever the cause is. I'm not going into that. It's a factor. We've got technology, technical issues, management activities, the whole lot. So you cannot walk away from risk in infrastructure. It's inherent, it's there. It needs to be mitigated and managed. We can also have risks in weak clients who don't make decisions. You have a program, you have a workforce, a decision is not made. You've got to try and now accommodate it elsewhere. It becomes unproductive work and rework, all of those kind of things. What about changes in design? You know, people think that, once the contract is signed, everything is going to work to plan. Let me give you an illustration. Think of you and your spouse deciding to build your dream house, okay? You get an architect in, and you get one of these high-tech architects, and the high-tech architect decides that he makes a computer model for you. You can now walk through on a computer model, and you sign off, and you say, this is the house we want. I guarantee you, when those walls are going up, and the doors go in, and the windows, your spouse comes to you and says, you know, my dear, if we move that door a meter over this way, we can accommodate that. Isn't that the way it's going to work? So change is going to take place to rectify oversights or to improve performance. So we've got risks in a number of categories. So now let's go through the concept of tendering now, or putting a price to something. What we're going to do is we're going to have on the left-hand side, I've got here the option of we're going to transfer all the risk to the contractor. So we're going to say, you take everything and we're going to take nothing. Okay? He's going to price for to provide the works in the information that you've given him. You're going to pay him for the cost of changes in delivery, which are your changes, and he's going to add his risk pricing to it. Now, the way it's going to work is he's going to add an amount in. He can't price all the risks that's going to occur on one site, but when he's got multiple sites, he's not going to get the same risk occurring on all sites unless it's COVID. So what is going to happen, he's going to spread his risk across different sites. So this one might go belly up and a lot of risks, but his risks didn't materialize on the other side. But if he has risk priced, if the event doesn't occur, he took the risk, he pockets the money. So what it does is it makes infrastructure very expensive if you pass all the risk. If you now turn around and you say, right, let's share the risk, and we go to the next side, what then happens is the contractor's only going to price for the risks that he is going to be exposed to, he's responsible for. Because remember, when a risk occurs, it's always going to translate into money somewhere. Someone's got to pay for it. Now, the client says, I will take those risks, and if they manifest, I need something called contingencies to pay for it because I contracted to take those risks. So this is where the whole thing comes in. It's not cost overruns when it goes over. It's risk events. It can be about risk events that occurred that were not the responsibility of the contractor. So the whole idea of transferring and having risk allocations is to make infrastructure cheaper, more affordable. So in other words, you as government, if you're the client, you are betting that some of the risks won't occur. So don't price them, Mr. Contractor. We will cover them, but I need contingencies to cover it. So I need to make a budgetary provision for it. So when we do our estimates of construction costs, we need to add something in for contingencies, but then manage efficiently to keep within those contingencies. Does this make sense? So we are trading in risk. Every value you've got of a construction contract has risk attached to it, and it's built in. Okay? I find the accountants don't understand that, but to them, that was the value. That was it. I can remember one of the former ministers of finance saying to me, but it's the QSs, they know, the industry knows right down to the cent what the cost of materials are. So why is there a change? Yeah, we do know that, but it's risk. We can't forecast all of that, and there are some risks that are foreseen, and we can understand how to manage them and price them, and there are others that are going to occur that are unforeseen. I now want to take you a little bit through some of the issues in industry, just that you understand fundamentally the differences between the construction industry and other industries, because it may help you understand why certain things are done in certain ways. Now, what I've got here is we hear about government introduced supply chain management. I'm sure you've come across that term in terms of procurement. Well, if you go back to the origins of it, they were talking about supply chain management as a financial function. It wasn't really about delivery of how projects are delivered, because different sectors have completely different supply chains. Thankfully, if we look at the Public Procurement Act, It no longer references supply chain management or any of those concepts. But in infrastructure is delivered through a supply chain. So what links everything together in infrastructure is the contracts that are entered into between each player in the supply chain. So when you come to infrastructure, one of the most important components of procurement, if you want to talk about it, is contract documents, because contract documents are saying what each party in the supply chain is to deliver and what risks they have to bear. So our contracts are very different to general goods and services because of risk. For example, if any of you are familiar with the National Treasury General Conditions of Contract, and I'm not criticizing it because it is designed for purchasing of goods. When you purchase the table that you're sitting at, you know what that table looks like. The risks are almost zero from a supplier point of view. No change management is occurring. Whereas when you come to construction, we're going to have risks event occurring. We're going to have allocation of risks. We're going to have change management. We're going to have to compensate contractors for risks that they never took place. So it is a completely different ball game. So when you come to infrastructure, contracts are important. So if we look here, we can have the client organization structure. And remember, we're never moving away from a buying and a selling process. So the client is the buyer. The contractors are the suppliers. And so we can have a supply chain where we can contract service providers who will then subcontract. We can have consultants who can have sub-consultants and service providers. We can have contractors that we can appoint, and you can see how it can go down the chain to many, many different layers. So we deliver infrastructure projects through a supply chain which is all bound together by contracts. Okay? Now, when we arrange this supply chain, we can have allocations for different risks. We can say to the contractor, apart from the normal risks you carry, would you do the design and carry that? We're going to have a contracting arrangement of a design and construct or a develop and construct approach. We can say to the contractor, we don't want you to take any design responsibility. We will retain that design responsibility. And what will then happen is we will appoint our consultants if we don't have the in-house resources, because things have changed. When I started in the industry, something like 80% of the people that were in my final year civil engineering class went and worked for government or municipalities. That's where we went. Those did their own designs, did everything. Over time, it has changed where now very few are going into government and a lot's going into consultants and contractors. The whole game has changed. So it's a decision of, do you want to have your people or appoint consultants or have a contractor do it? And so we've got our different permutations that can be done in terms of different allocations. So don't think of just a contractor doesn't do design. We can allocate any level of design responsibility. But if we do delegate design responsibility, we need to be mature enough to understand how to manage the outputs that come back. Okay? Now, let me go through some of the characteristics of construction projects, and you'll begin to see that one of the problems that we've had in the past is conceptualizing procurement, which is a strategic function, as a financial function. That is going to change in the future, and I think things are changing. So I'm just mentioning it in passing. But the critical thing is what makes things different. The business need is frequently satisfied through multiple contracts which need to be procured and managed in such a way that the anticipated benefits are progressively realized. So if we're going to run a project, don't have one contract. We might have many, many contracts to put in place and manage. I have given you an example of the delivery of the new universities. I was personally involved in that, responsible for the procurement and some of the delivery management aspects, together with a team. And if you look there, in 3 years, to establish the University of Mpumalanga and the Sol Plaatje University, we put in place 219 contracts to do that. Now, you've also got there, we had something like 19,000 items of furniture and so on, and all these other bits and pieces, because you had to, it's no good just delivering the infrastructure. It's got to be fully furnished to have it fully operational. If it doesn't have the audio-visual equipment in it, you're not going to start your teaching. Now, all of that has to be put in place. Now, the problem is, if I have 1 or 2 of those contracts that are delayed and are not completed, I can't complete my project. There's a knock-on effect. So this attitude of, I'm doing this procurement independent of that and not linked together, is one of our biggest problems in trying to deliver infrastructure, because you're waiting for the consultants, or you've got all the consultants and oops, I forgot, I needed a fire engineer. Now I've got to go and stop the whole project while I go through some kind of process to put that person in place. You get the picture. So it has to be dealt with differently. There are several interfaces and independencies between contracts where delays in a failure to put in place one contract can significantly increase project costs. And so when you come to evaluate, from a procurement point of view, I have nothing wrong with our constitutional requirements, but it's how it's applied. It's not cost effective to necessarily have open tender for everything, because you might have one small component that you need to do quickly to keep the project going, that you might have to have a different kind of dispensation. Okay, on occasion, not the norm. Thankfully, the new Public Procurement Act has, after a lot of flack from industry and others, does require separate regulations for infrastructure. We'll see if that occurs. Demand is most often determined and managed through service life plans. And that's all about the assessment of current performance against desired levels of service and functionality and plans. And I will be going in detail through the Government Immovable Asset Management Act, as well as taking you through asset management, because asset management drives infrastructure. It's not about, I have a store and I have a bin level that's low, I need to replace my bin level. That's a different type of procurement, different type of operation. So asset management drives everything, okay? Demand needs to be proactively managed through the planning, acquisition, contract management phases to prevent scope creep. Problem is, you start with something, and as you run through it, people say, yeah, but let's just add this, we just do this. While you're over there, and suddenly it balloons. And that's what's got to be watched. It's got to be actively engaged all the way through. I can remember in delivering the new universities, we had a very strict delivery manager who was quite correct. And when the staff at the university said when they wanted chairs, they wanted leather chairs, he turned around and said, what the hell has leather chairs got to do with education? My mission is education. I don't have to have the fancies. You see, it's so easy to slip into the gold plating. There's also a range of different options and combinations of goods and services with different initial costs, life cycle costs. We can have a very experienced, expensive designer who produces a more efficient design than someone who is inexperienced at a lower price. There's also delivering of projects. If you get the A team that's delivering, you might have a lower might have a higher initial cost, but because they're better able to manage the risks and changes, we could come in at a lower price at the end. So we've got a huge amount of mixtures in there as well. Risks are high due to uncertainties. One of the things I've learned in my career is when I was at university, risk was all about rolling a dice, probability theory and things like that with mathematics. What I've come to understand is the best definition that I can give in this context is the impact of uncertainty on objectives. And you see, the industry is all about uncertainty and trying to manage it. That definition is the ISO definition for risk. So risk is the impact of uncertainty on objectives. Can be positive and it can be negative. We worry about the negative ones usually. Okay. A supply chain frequently needs to be contracted, mobilized, and overseen to provide the necessary professional services. And this is the last point I've got here, is because of risk and because of change management, the starting price of a contract is not the same as the final cost of the contract. There is going to be differences because of risk events that occur. And I think this needs to be well understood because people think, well, we awarded a contract at this, there's not going to be increase. Well, when the contract was awarded, was price adjustment for inflation included or not? Did the contractor carry that risk? There's a simple thing of what is going to go up and things like that. So one has got to be very careful about it. I hope that's given you some sort of insights as to why the industry is so different. I now want to take you through tier contracting, just to understand how the industry functions. And I'm not going to go into a lot of the socioeconomic side of things. I'm rather just trying to keep it at a principle level today, that you understand how the industry operates normally. What happens is we have the tier one is a general contractor. So the idea of the general contractor is you appoint one person that has single point accountability for delivering a piece of work. He may well subcontract it out to others, and we do have subcontracting to use as an instrument of policy. I'm well aware of that. We also have specialist subcontractors, because for a main contractor to keep specialist expertise in his team isn't cost effective, because he doesn't have work for them all the time. Rather, you have the pool of specialists and pull them in. Now, what I wanted to say to you is, if you look at the profits and company overheads of construction companies, it's a very low margin industry. It is typically between 5 and 8%. The guys are quite happy with that. In hard times, it's actually lower than that. So you're looking at 2 to 3% profit margins in the industry at the larger players. So this is something to be understood, because I have known some people, if I've asked the question, particularly in some of the provinces and things like that, where people are not commercially minded, the belief is that our contractors are making 30% profit plus. It's not the case. Remember, it's a very competitive industry, because everything goes out to tender, whether it's public or private. Private sector put it out to tender as well to get the market prices. So it's a low margin industry. Now, if you put many layers down, you're getting the markup and profits might be higher lower down, but it's going to add up that your cost is profit and overheads of different players. So I just wanted to make that clear. In terms of our industry, we also have, in terms of our contracts, 3 types of subcontractors. And, like, for example, when the preferential procurement regulations came out about the mandatory subcontracting was not defined. Now, subcontracting could be materials, could be anything in the general sense of it, because anything you don't have, you've subcontracted to provide. in our industry, subcontracting means something specific. A domestic subcontractor is if you've appointed that subcontractor, as far as the contract is concerned, we're not interested in that. That's the affair of the contractor. We're viewing him to be responsible for delivering the work as if he had not subcontracted. The second level we've got is what we would call a selected subcontractor. The idea there is that the employer or the client and the contractor will go through a process to select the subcontractors. So in other words, the client has had a say, the contractor has a say. The minute the subcontractor is appointed, he becomes the same as a domestic subcontractor. But there's been the opportunity to put that in place. That is typically run on all our electrical, mechanical, those kind of specialist subcontracts. The third one would be a nominated subcontract where the client would force the marriage. He would say, this is the person I want, and normally that is going to come with some guarantees that if that person doesn't perform, the contractor's let off the hook. It's not often used, but what I was just mentioning is we do have definite understanding of different types of subcontractors. Okay, joint ventures. Now, I'm taking you through the traditional legitimate reasons for joint ventures. Okay, I'm not going to go into some of the other types of things where people do fronting and all the rest of it. I'm just going to talk you basically through it. A joint venture is essentially a grouping of two or more contractors acting as one legal entity where each is liable for the actions of the other. Now it's basically an unincorporated joint venture that I'm talking about, an unincorporated arrangement, which is the same as a partnership. If you formed a joint venture company where you've gone and registered in terms of the Companies Act, you're an incorporated company and you're viewed as a single entity. Now, joint ventures are normally unincorporated. The members pool their resources because if you have a large contract, they may not have all the resources to do that contract, or alternatively, the risks are so high if that project goes the wrong way, they carry the full can and they can put themselves out of business. But they want to do the work, so then you enter into a joint venture with another company of a similar size or similar arrangements, and then you share the risks on the projects, and you can also pool your resources. You can also have joint ventures where they break work down into discrete elements, and you work on, I'm doing that element or I'm doing this element, or you can form a joint venture. For example, you might have professional consultants that join with the contractor. They take responsibility for the design. The contractor takes responsibility for the construction. So the successful operation is all about a high degree of trust and cooperation, because you're jointly and severally bound. So the reasons for joint venture is when it's too large, complex for a company to undertake, when you require specialist skills and abilities which you don't have yourself, and of course in developing countries, particularly in countries like South Africa, it has been used very, very successfully to develop emerging companies, black companies, or women
an exercise. I really like this. If we could go to the key metros, let's go and collect that they've been implementing. And let's go look at contingencies and how they've been used. I can guarantee you almost every one of them have used up all their contingencies, if not asked for more money on the projects. And why is that? Because the QSs, those engineers, because some of them are not really engineers, they're in the municipalities that's drawing up the specs, are not doing the correct job. The bulk of the work is going to consultants, external consultants. Perhaps what we should consider as this national department is to create a bank of consultants that will be used in projects throughout the country. Because it doesn't make sense for a municipality in Pofada to engage a engineer that may build one little bridge for the whole year. So we should look at saying, municipalities, put your monies together. Let's have this working with COCTA. We have a pool of consultants that they could use whenever they need to, and we ensure that standards are being met. That will be the last statement I make for the day, Chair. Thank you very
100%.
much.
Do you want me to very briefly answer them or after tea? Okay, have your tea. Yeah. Yeah, sure. Look, I'm really in your hands. If you don't ask questions, I just carry on. Okay. Okay, so we'll come back at 20 past. I'm going to answer it very quickly. I'm not being flippant, but I think as we go through, we'll try and pick up some of the issues as well. The blip we had in 2010, actually, if you analyzed it, the amount spent on the infrastructure wasn't a big spike in terms of it. It was, we went up to the sort of 8%. Had we continued the trajectory to the 8 to 10%, we would have had a sustainable industry. The industry is cyclic. It's always been cyclic, but we've been plowed into a deep trough, because what happens is the municipalities or government doesn't spend its money, so Treasury revises it lower, 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 lower. I should have shown a diagram I cut out because I was trying to keep it to a minimum. And that's the downward spiral. We need to be able to deliver infrastructure effectively. Private sector, you talk about like we can have the most brilliant bankable projects on paper, but the rubber meets the road in implementation. If we can't implement projects within budget on time, you're not going to get private sector involvement. One of the biggest problems in my view, and I've done quite a lot of work on it and bumped a brick wall, we have what is regarded as some of the best or most stringent, should we rather say, rules for public-private partnerships. Government is very risk averse. You see, the French allowed the risks to take place. They backed the private sector. They didn't say, oh, we don't believe the private sector can deliver it on time, we'll have to do another plan. Do you know what I mean? So what we do is we go through a process because we've also interpreted procurement in a certain way. So what you're doing is you're asking a contractor to go through a complete design so you're going through a dual process. You've got a transaction advisor who says, is it feasible to go to a PPP, designs a lot of the stuff. Then you get a contractor, they put it out to tender. Contractor then has to provide his solution, pay for his designs and all the rest of it, and only then do they enter into a partnership. Now, it's very intensive and you may not win. So you go and do something else that's unattractive. Whereas if you rather selected your partner and worked on some kind of cost basis to arrive at a point in time where you can fix the prices in moving forward, you'd have a lot more interest, and you'd cut 18 months to 2 years out of the cycle. So there are ways of doing it, okay? You also raised about those that were trained during the construction to do the maintenance. Now, there are projects that have been done like that. eThekwini in the years gone by, a couple of around the 2010 time, did the upgrading of the secondary water mains. And what they said is, let's have 16 subcontractors that would work on it to develop them over time, that they would then do the maintenance activities. So there are models around to do that. Yeah, I put the contracts together for it. Yeah. Okay, so there's examples. But I think what it comes down to is what I will be talking more and more about is the client function. It was pointed out to me, and I fully subscribe to that the most important critical success factor in any project, irrespective of where it is, irrespective of size and complexity, is the role of the client. And that's what I'm going to spend a lot of time on. You wanted to ask some questions? Yep.
Sorry, thank you. So I'll provide the service at a profit. 9 times out of 10, and I think Honorable already raised the issue, is that the service provider will always try and maximize on their profit. In maximizing on their profit, they tend to compromise a lot of things, whether it's in personnel or quality of the work or material and so on and so forth. So, what in your experience, what would you provide as a guideline to mitigate between the compromise of the service and the profit making of the service provider?
I'm not going to answer you now.
Okay.
I'm going to take you through a process, and please ask. Part of the problem that you raised.
Okay, but I
about-
have 3 more questions.
Go for it. No, go for it, because
Okay.
I prefer having it, because then
Yes.
I'll talk to it as we go along.
Okay, no problem.
Okay.
Okay. So my second question is, so because the state is permanently in need of infrastructure, right? In terms of risk management, would you not agree that it would make sense for the state to own equipment that is permanently in need for infrastructure, but also some of the personnel, so that the state is able to share the risk between themselves and the service provider? I'll give you an example. So, for instance, the Joburg Roads Agency, they used to own an asphalt manufacturing company. And I have no idea what the history is there, but that facility is now sitting unused. It has been like that for years now, even though they've trained people, they've taken people to Germany and so on and so forth, but it's unused. And they stopping to use that facility has raised their expenses in produce. So now they have to go to Much Asphalt and all of these other companies. So would it not make sense for us to be able to own, as a state, to own these things, manage them properly, if it's done correctly, that is, so that we reduce risk and cost? My next question, you mentioned fronting, because from a political perspective, politicians have the responsibility to make sure that we equalize the space and so on and so forth. So you've had plenty experience in putting together these contracts and so on and so forth. What is the solution to fronting? That's the first thing. And secondly, why is it that we have not, it's part of, I guess, part of the same question. Why is it that we have not been able to deal with the fact that the biggest construction companies today are still white and male owned? WHBO, what's the other one? Concor or something. Yeah. All of them. If you look at the top 10 construction companies, they're mostly white. Why have we not been able to equalize the space at that level? That's it.
Well, Group 5's no more.
Eh?
Most of our big companies are gone. I actually also am a technical advisor to the board of the Lesotho Highlands project. And I can tell you now, all the main works have been done by Chinese contractors. We don't have South African contractors. Yeah.
Oh.
And they're coming into the roads here as well, because we don't have. Most of our major companies have gone. But I'll try and address what you're talking about. I'll weave it in as we go along. A lot of it comes down to the client's role and not being what we would call the intelligent client or the learned client or whatever it is. You were talking about people having gaps and maybe the profit margins are low, but they find other ways of doing it. If you've got poor documents that are put out, poor contracts that are put in place, poor leadership, lack of leadership, all of those kind of things, it's fair game. So can I take you through the next lot? But
Yes.
please, if I come to the end of the day or tomorrow or whatever, and I haven't answered your questions, just raise them again. I'm not ducking them, okay? Very happy to talk those things through. I mean, I ran Soweto's contractor development program when Mandela was on Robben Island. So we developed civil engineering contractors from scratch because there were none in the late 1980s.
Okay.
So I've had a long track record of that, and we can have discussions around it.
I do have a question.
Happy to discuss geotech as well. Okay, what I want to show you now, and I presume we're stopping is at 4:30. What is the timing of it? It didn't say on the program, but I assumed it. 4:15 it was on the. Okay, 4:15, I'll stop. Okay, so what I wanted to show you here, this is the critical diagram of how you're going to deliver. No, we're not going that far. You're going to wear me out. Okay, so what is the starting point with the delivery of a project? Is what I call the client value proposition, which is the promise of measurable benefits or impacts resulting from the project. Otherwise, why would we do it? Okay. Now, fast forward to the end, we have something what I've called is project value. And what is project value? The outcome of the client decision making to achieve an optimal balance of project benefits, risks, and costs. Okay? So to get from the start to the finish, decisions need to be made by the client. Okay? So ask the question, if clients, if we take a department, they have a mandate. Infrastructure serves the mandate of the department because infrastructure projects are not projects on their own. They link into something else, okay? So are they engaged in leading the projects? Or do they just dump it on some junior project manager to try and sort out the fronting, to sort out all the issues and not understanding how the industry works? You need to be that knowledgeable client that can stand up to industry nonsense and sort them out. Comes to the client function. So let's see the journey of getting there. You're going to start and you're going to have, before you come to project value, you're going to have project outcomes and impacts is what I want to talk about this afternoon. Tomorrow we'll go into some of the details of how to get there. But if you look at it, you're going to have infrastructure which is going to have its functionality and work, and there your quality comes into it, all of those good things that you want. You're also going to have your sustainability impacts, which is going to be environmental, social, and economic. And you're also going to have public value. And I'll touch upon public value right at the end, because otherwise, why are we doing this? Projects have to have some have some public value. Now, how do we get from A to B? We've got to start off by having a client defining what they want as a brief. The brief will include the infrastructure and the expectations around empowerment. If empowerment is not driven, it's not going to happen. It's like the biggest mistake we ever made in this country with empowerment was we converted it into a form that was inserted into a tender document. Who was managing it? What is the expectations? It's not there. If you don't ask for it, to me, the socioeconomic has got to be part of the deliverables of the infrastructure. Like we have hard infrastructure, we need to specify what we want. When that starts happening and you take an active management of it, the fronting disappears and those kind of things. So it all comes down to the statement I made is the role of the client. Okay? So what is the role of the client here? Is set the value proposition. What then they've got to do is, you'll see I've got the resources required to deliver the project, and you've got the project activities that need to be done. Okay? So what is the role of the client to get from value proposition to project outcomes? They have to plan, specify, what do they want? And the specification runs right down into the empowerment, project benefits, all of those kind of things. You're then going to procure, and then you're going to oversee delivery. Now, procure is to get the resources. You were talking about Joburg Water. You know that Department of Water and Sanitation has departmental units. Did you know that? They used to build all the dams departmentally. And what has happened is they have been crippled because of the procurement process. They can't procure the materials, they stand. But it's more beneficial in this country to tick a few boxes around procurement rather than get the job done. If we looked at our constitution, and I'll come to that as well in a later session, I don't want to run too far ahead, otherwise we won't get through the session, but go and have a look at what is public administration to do. Use resources efficiently, effectively, and economically. 195. No, 217 is your fair, equitable, transparent, competitive, cost-effective. But the Constitutional Court had to tell Treasury, it's not just that. It's to use resources efficiently, effectively, economically, in a development-orientated and accountable and ethical manner. 195. And promotion of administrative justice kicks in. That it needs to be reasonable. Where's the rational connection in a lot of these decisions? Oh, we went for the lowest tenderer. Is it a rational decision? Do you understand where the problem is? But look, I'm not going to get into too much of that. So what I'm saying here is you've got two processes. Do you see I've got project management controlling practices? That is where you're going to be your reporting of what you plan to do and what you have achieved. But what you need is the client delivery management, the influencing practices. Because I now report that my project is 3 months late. So what? I've done my job. But you need your delivery manager to say, how are we going to get this project back on track? Come on, guys. Where's the leadership? You see, you need management and you need leadership. The public sector need to lead as knowledgeable clients. You with me? That's the missing ingredient. Okay? I spoke about the New Universities Project. We did that using public sector funds, public sector rules. It was Department of Higher Education, appointed Wits University being an organ of state to do as implementing agent. 28 months from political decision to opening the doors of 2 universities with staff, with facilities, and below cost norms. Can be done. It's all about delivery management, leadership. If you don't have leadership, you're going to have a consultant and client-driven process that is going to serve their interests and not the client's interest. You got me? Okay. So this is the critical thing. So I keep coming back, is what you get at the end is a function of the client's decision making. Okay? Right, so some of the infrastructure concepts, if we just, I'm going to go through some of this very quickly, just so that I finish at 4:15. Infrastructure, and this is the point I want to make, infrastructure projects are necessary to support the strategic and business objectives of the client organization. Now, if we've got disengaged senior management in organizations from projects, what's going to happen? Projects are going to go in whichever direction they want to go. So it's a leadership issue. You with me? Because you can't outsource your client responsibilities. At the end of the day, the client, the consultant and the contractor can turn around and saying, we did our deliverables, but we never really got the benefits you wanted and all the rest of it and things like that. They're not responsible for it. Government sits with the outcome of the project. One of the best lessons I've seen in that was Edinburgh schools in the UK. They went a public-private partnership where they said, let's just dump everything to the private sector. They can deliver the schools, they can maintain the schools. We sit as a client and do nothing, okay? All our job was to appoint them. What happened is one day in a windstorm, a gable end collapsed in a school playground. Had kids been there, it would have killed kids. They investigated a study. They found that a simple thing, and I am oversimplifying it a bit, but the fundamental problem was that the wall ties weren't sufficiently embedded and connected back to the columns. Very basic construction error. They then looked at how many sites had the same contractor built with the same inherent problem. Suddenly, 120 schools were closed. 8 to 10,000 kids were out of school. And who carries the can? Not the contractor. He can just dissolve his company and reopen it somewhere else. He can cease training. So the client remains accountable for the project outcomes. So the point I'm making here is infrastructure supports the service delivery mandate of the department that requires it. So therefore, their senior management should be engaged in the projects. Am I right? If you don't do that, you're going to have chaos, and that's what we've got. Okay. Right. So the linkages between projects and objectives, because what people forget, and I'm not going to belabor the point, is we're not building infrastructure. If you look here, we're building like a regular access to sports facilities would be a school gymnasium. We've got to change our thinking of this is the infrastructure we're building as the asset, but why are we building it? And that links to the objectives of the organization, and that needs to be sorted out from that. So what we need to know about the outcome is the change resulting from the use of the output or deliverables of the project. So senior management has to be engaged. So ask the question wherever you go, where is senior management in this? What decision making are they doing? Are they delegating it down to the lowest common denominator, some junior project manager to make decisions? He doesn't know what decision to be made. So we've got to find a way of capacitating it. Now, one of the things you can do very quickly, what I learned from the university side of things when we delivered, we had very close relationship between the implementing agent and the DDG from DHET. The two of them met every second week to discuss things, okay? Total understanding of needs, getting rid of blockages, etc. Now, the client delivery manager cannot know everything, and I'll discuss this tomorrow, but he can contract expertise from the private sector on a as and when required basis. I worked on that for years as an as and when required. So if he needed advice, I gave him advice, but I wasn't actively involved in the project, because if I was actively involved in the project, there'd be a conflict of interest. There are lots of people that are out there, the capacity is there, but government needs to lead the project and make the decisions. And I think that's my position. Look, my background is when I started work, I worked for South African Railways and Harbours. They were still a government department before they even became a state-owned enterprise. We did our own construction works. We did our own design, all the rest of it. I've lived through all of that. But what you've got to do is that is gone, but the control and the direction and the leadership must be retained by the state. Okay? So we can go through all of these things just to mention to you that infrastructure can be dealing with refurbishment, rehabilitation, alteration, maintenance. I've given you definitions if you ever need to come back. I'm not going to spend time on that. We now come to value for money concept. We talk about value for money. So look at my theory of change. What you've got is cost, input, activities, output, outcomes, impact. So when you come to your planning is all about your economy. Your implementation is about efficiency. And closeout is about effectiveness. And the question you raised was what sits underneath the whole lot? Equity. The whole building of black business, whatever the objectives are of the state, what they want to achieve. That needs to underlie it. So what I've got here is the critical questions that need to be asked as you go through in delivering value for money. In your economy, you're focusing, the key question is what is the cost of the resources consumed and the value of the output required? Your efficiency is how resourcefully are inputs converted into outputs and subsequent outcomes. Now, if you're not managing that phase, you will never achieve the outcomes and benefits that you're looking for, because the private sector are coming with a different set of values. And if you shape them and you work collaboratively with them, you can have some stunning results. But they need to be led and directed, and you need people who can, on equal terms, embrace and deal with them. The minute you've got the power relationship down with some junior that comes along, hiding to nothing. I'm sure you've seen it with lawyers, that you find a junior counsel comes into the senior counsel's office and it's like the school kid coming into the headmaster's office, and you know where it's going to go. Same thing. Okay? You're then going to have your effectiveness is what is the gap between what was achieved and what was intended. You see, we've got to start measuring value for money as the gap between what we planned and what we intended. If you don't measure that, nobody watches what happens in between. Que sera, whatever will be, will be. Okay? So there's part of it. And then, of course, the equity is what legacy does the project leave behind. All the issues you spoke about, employment, job creation, empowerment, whatever you want to talk about. Okay? So that's how it would run. So just looking at the gap, the value for money is really about, the key question is, does it provide value for money? And what is the gap between what was planned and what was delivered? And we should be measuring that. Why don't we? So if I plan that I'm going to have people getting workplace experience towards professional registration, we can measure it at the end. What did you plan to do? What did you achieve? If you don't measure it, nobody's going to worry about it. There's your problem. So, and if a project is delivered efficiently and we do have a gap, we can explain it sometimes around risk events that occurred. There are some projects where a risk event is going to occur, and no matter what you do, it's going to be the dog. But that should be the exception to the rule. We should be delivering very close to what we planned. Okay? Yeah, look, just by the way, as part of the contingencies being overspent and things like that, that was also an own goal by Treasury, because Treasury brought an instruction out that they needed to give permission to approve a cost increase of above 20%. It took industry over 10 years to get Treasury to understand the risk events, because Treasury never said, what about price adjustment for inflation, the risks that were allocated. We had court cases that were settled on the steps and things like that because people didn't understand it. So all that happened is people find a way around it. So all officials did is inflated everything by 20%. Man, I came in under budget. And if you put contingencies in a contract, I'll give you a written guarantee it will be spent. We rather use the grovel technique, that the more contingency you want, the more higher up you're going to grovel to get permission, right up to your DG. And it's amazing, people find alternative solutions. Okay, so there's ways and means of doing it. Okay, so that's the gap. Now, coming back to this managing and leading, and I will expand upon it a bit more tomorrow to give you a bit more detail. I'm just trying to get the concepts across. If you really look at it, you've got different wheels that are running. You have your value proposition is the promise of measurable benefits. And where is that coming from? The governance of an organization. The accounting officer and his team with politicians that are putting in values, because you're going to be looking at the three things is effective performance, ethical behavior, and responsible stewardship. Isn't those the three sort of pillars that you would be deciding on what you want to achieve? Your infrastructure is part of it, but it's not the whole. It's all these other things you should be looking at. So that is going to inform your value proposition and your client brief. If that doesn't take place, you've left it to a form to be filled in or someone else to do it. It's not driven. You know, you talk about the 30% subcontracting. I ran the affirmative procurement program for public works in the 1990s. We changed from what we believed was a 0.5% black share of the market to 33% in 1999. Because it was driven, it was processed, it wasn't a form that was fitted into a contract. All of these things can be done, but it takes effort. You then come to your project manager is looking at budget, schedule, and quality. And what is your client delivery team looking at, who's leading the project? They need to look at knowledgeable leadership, a consistent governance, so we can account for what is spent. We've got no leakages, all the rest of it, and systematic administration. And if that is all done and comes together, we are going to have outputs, outcomes, and benefits. Okay? That's the model. So the context with, I also wanted to just mention this to you, and I'm not going to go too deeply into it. If you read up in that book that I gave you, there's a lot more information on that. But think of it this way, and it also helps you to understand the role of the client. Think of the areas. We have an underlying regional context. I have a project in a region. That region has its own dynamics. There's culture, language, all of those kind of things, regional economies, etc. We then have the organization that has its own governance and constraints. Then we've got the project controls, which are controlling the interface between the project, and managing the project, the time, cost, quality, and budget. And then we have the activities. Now you see the red lines that I've drawn there are the boundaries. Now, who's managing the boundary between the organization and the regional context is the governing body. So now we have a regional context where we have, let's just take, for example, let's use the term construction mafia that are stopping jobs. What do they do? They push it down to the delivery team to sort out. They can't manage that boundary. They are trained and comfortable to use the project controls and activity. So you see, you've got to have the whole thing working. Your client delivery manager has got to work between the organization and the project team. If you now take the client delivery manager out and you take the governance that's silent on a project, no wonder they fail. Am I making sense? Okay? If we just touched upon, and I'm just purely introducing the topics here, and I'm not going to go into too much into the South African context, I'm just trying to give examples of what would happen. We have our sustainability impacts. And what we want from a sustainability impact is, sustainability is the goal of sustainable development, and we're always going to have social, economic, and environmental. And so what we're trying to do is to have the lens and focus to get a balance between all of it. I will touch upon the Climate Change Act, which has now been brought in, because we need to also start looking at some of our commitments to the environment and move forward. The social issues that we've got here, and I've just listed some of them typically, so to have just a broad spectrum, almost like a menu of things, is accessibility, access to buildings, adaptability, health and well-being, impacts on neighborhoods, safety and security, human rights, labor rights, all of these things, stimulating economic activity. We have many of these things, but you need client direction as to what you're prioritizing for a project. You're not going to have all of them kicking in at the same time. So there's a prioritization that needs to take place, and that is part of the leadership. You need to lead projects and not just manage or attempt to manage them and report. In fact, what I've found is if you're looking at a project that lacks leadership, go onto a site and go and ask the contractor, who does he think the client is? And he will tell you the department. And you say, now, who in the department? Could be so-and-so, could be so-and-so. What does that mean? There's no leadership. If you walk on a site where there is the leader that is there, every single person knows who the client is, that person. So this is where we've got to have that leadership to start teasing out what social issues we're going to have as benefits in terms of our projects. Climate change, I just want to touch upon it. I don't want to go into detail because this is something that's becoming more and more prevalent. Climate change is defined as the change in the state of the climate that can be identified by changes in the mean and in the mean and variability of properties that persists for an extended period of time. So historically, we've had a flood level at this level. We now have something different because of climate change, and we've got to start adapting towards that. And so we have commitments with cutting down the greenhouse gases, as I say, because that's the gases is trapping the heat in, the earth is warming up, and we have signed international agreements. I mean, in 2015, we signed the Copenhagen, at least the Paris Accord, and it's only now in 2024 that we've actually published our act as a Climate Change Act. So I think in the future, we've got to start thinking more about how do we deal with climate change at the same time. I'm just saying it's one of the extra things that is coming in. So we've made commitments to try and reduce the temperature, to review commitments every 5 years, and so on. And there's also a lot of finance that's coming in that we need to tap into for green finance. In other words, the guilt from the guys that caused the problem in the north need to help us out in the south. So all of those kind of things are also coming in. And why I say that is buildings are responsible for, depending upon which figures you look at and which sources, but typically it's understood that we're about almost 40% of global energy-related carbon emissions come from our industry. So the construction industry is a very high contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. Our materials, manufacturing of aluminium, all of those kind of things have huge environmental impacts. So we can't as an industry say, well, we'll leave it to some other industry because we're one of the biggest guilty parties, and we've got to find ways of trying to reduce that. In terms of environmental considerations, I've listed just typically what the international communities are sort of concerned about. And I think it really comes down to, in our neck of the wood, is the choices made with regarding of building materials, construction methods and resources. And if you think of that, if you change the technology to make it more labor friendly, that's where we had some of the expanded public works programs, labor intensivity, all of that took place in changing the technology to make it more labor friendly, new technologies that are coming in. All of those things we've got to think about, not just in terms of the environment, but also in terms of job creation and the social impact. We've also got the operating energy, water services and sanitation to consider. So those are other factors that come in. I now want to touch upon resilience, just that we understand the concept, because this is also something that's coming in more and more, asking about what is resilience. Let me try and explain it to you very briefly, because resilience is going to require far more coordination across government than just me sorting my problem out. Resilience is the ability to anticipate, adapt, resist, or quickly recover from a potentially disruptive event, whether natural or man-made. So in other words, we now have like floods in Natal. We wiped out how many houses, families, communities, all the rest of it, but have we bounced back? Eh? Not at all. Sorry? Yeah. So we've got to think of ways of how do we bounce back. And remember, when those floods came, it didn't destroy all the infrastructure, but the vulnerable infrastructure got hammered. So what we've now got to think about, how do we protect the vulnerable? Because for us to raise the level of a higher standard across everything, we can't afford it. Nowhere in the world can you afford it. So we need to find that. So the whole concept of it is that whatever the source of the hazard is, can we bounce back? How can we make the vulnerabilities less vulnerable? Okay. Now, if you think about that, and we've now got roads, we've got bridges, we've got buildings, we've got water, we've got sewage, all of those kind of things. So we need to work collaboratively with all the owners to decide on what the vulnerable thing is and what we're going to invest in. Because I can have a nice resilient building and the power gets knocked out. What am I going to do? So we need to think broader, and this is going to pose a lot more cross-questioning between different stakeholders. So in terms of resilience thinking, is we've got to shift from, we've always designed for foreseeable risks. We can't do for the climate change associated higher risks. So therefore, what we've got to do is we've got to think about different strategies. Don't rely on the strength to protect it alone. Try and find redundancies, alternatives. So in other words, if I have a supply cut out here, how do I get an alternative? I mean, recently we had Rand Water had a pumps out. I was for 11 days without water because there was no backup, you know, and it's this kind of thinking that we've got to get to. I know for me, 11 days is no problem. I mean, people have been for years without water in other parts of the country, but I'm just using it as an illustration point that we need to have different entities in government have got to have serious discussions about the what ifs and how do we spend to smooth those out. We've also got to consider all the relevant components and their reliability, and then of course the active management of it. In other words, the disaster management. So for example, I could now design bridges that are such that if I do have an extreme flood, I might lose a bridge deck, but I don't lose the piers and all the rest of it. I can very quickly come back, particularly if it's precast elements, and reopen it very quickly. So it's all of this type of thinking has now got to start coming to the fore, but it's not going to happen without client leadership. Because consultant comes along and says, we need to design this more resilient, it's going to double the project cost. Do you understand what I'm saying? We've got to find a way of having those serious conversations to deal with resilient infrastructure, because we need to balance the cost and the responses. So, I mean, it runs right the way through to procurement. We should have had, I mean, one of the biggest problems was, I mean, I was talking to one of the implementing agents who was telling me a year later, even with all the dispensations they had for emergency procurement, they still hadn't done anything. We've got to change our thinking, and it's all about leadership. Public value is what I want to end off on today. To me, public value is the value of that an organization or activity contributes to society. So when we've finished our infrastructure, what is the value to it? Because it's not just about the bricks and mortar. It's all the things you were raising. All of those kind of things need to be done. So what we've got to do is we've got to think, it's about the collective objectives of society. We've got to have far more stakeholder engagement to find out what people want, what the impact is of things. And not just, you know, when I started in engineering, it was very much you built a road for A to B and you didn't worry about the community or the environment, you built the road. That was what the purpose is. But life has changed. We can't do that anymore, and it's not the right thing to do. We've got to find what is the optimum. And so that's where the client has to lead that process at a senior level, not at a bottom level. And, you know, and so many people, like someone was talking about retaining staff in the public sector. Now, if they're not valued and they're not listened to, they're going to go somewhere else. If they've got senior management that is going to have an ear to the proposals that they put forward, because I can tell you this young generation of professionals that are coming up really want to make a difference. They've got some wonderful contributions to be made, but they are blocked because nobody listens to them, you know. And so we need to find ways of having senior guys engaging in these conversations and make the decisions, because the project outcomes are a function of decision making. So what we need to do is we need to think about the deliverables, we need to think about the outcomes, we need to think about the outputs, and we need to think about benefits. And look, it's not just that we have a problem in South Africa. For example, I think many of you, if you've ever studied project management, I'm sure you came across the PMI PMBOK body of knowledge. You do know that between version 6 and 7, which took place in the last 2-3 years, the first 1 to 6 has basically been binned because it's not working. Now, ISO has brought out a new standard for project management, and they talk about benefits management. Isn't those the kind of things we should be having? Do you know what I mean? So, but you can't manage it if it hasn't been specified by the client. So this comes to think about the project value. What is the benefit, which is the created advantage, value, or other positive? And these are definitions that I've pulled out of the latest ISO standard. People are starting to move towards saying we need to have these things sorted out. Business cases. How many business cases have you seen for even the smallest of projects? We should be having a business case, and the business case should spell out the project value, the public value, what we're doing in the environment, and what we're doing with the infrastructure. It just needs to be put in place, because then that will be the briefing to the resources we procure. The private sector should be dancing to the tune that government has set. Okay? So if we looked at this, so public value contains either explicitly or implicitly key expectations and objectives of all stakeholders in infrastructure development. So the public value considerations, and I'll stop here because we're coming up to 4:15, but if you look at sustainability is going to have environmental, social, economic, and our value proposition is always going to be the promise of what we're going to get. And we're going to have to think about project value which is the outcome of our client decision making to achieve a balance between benefits, risks, and costs. What can we achieve with the constraints that we issued with? And that's where the measures we're going to have of value when we decide on projects. We need to think about what are our preferences, and preferences is something that is more going to have to be sorted out at a political level. Do we prefer BE over this or over that or whatever? Those are the kind of things that need to be done. We also need to have what is our contribution to goals in terms of sustainability. We also need to think about what are our priorities. We've really got to stop as a nation and say, what are our priorities in moving forward? And we should be designing projects to accommodate those priorities. And we should also think about the relations. We need to think more about the stakeholders that we are engaging where we're delivering infrastructure, to make sure that the infrastructure we're delivering, they feel a part of and can participate in it. And that will also lead to local economic development and those kind of things that also need to be tied in. I think I'll stop there. I hope that this sort of tried to just crystallize the role of the client, because tomorrow I will take you through some of the more detailed process, but still high level, of how asset management works, how delivery management should work, how budgeting and planning works, and then we'll go into the afternoon looking at some of the roles of the various institutions that we've got and the various pieces of legislation. But I hope this gives you a context to start engaging in. Any questions? See, I am a project manager. Exactly, I've got a minute to go. Yeah. Sorry, you want to ask? Look, it's a difficult one, because in the past it worked very well, and it worked. I've spent quite a bit of time with the construction units of Department of Water and Sanitation, and it still worked until the procurement system became prohibitive. In other words, it was more important to have compliance than to get things done. And I'm not saying that people were dishonest or anything like that. It was just the processes became so extended, the various committees, the various this, comes back to decision making. Where they had quick decision making, because I mean the department has, there's workshops in Jan Kempsdorp. They've got entire workshops that are kitted out to do these massive valve replacements, and it really does make sense. But we've got to get the management sorted out and the resources and things like that going. And there's so much stuff that's just lying, waiting for this. And look, water and sanitation have had a problem. It's been a couple of years. Their whole procurement system has been broken. They're trying to fix it and move forward. So if you can address some of the constraints, which I believe are self-inflicted, I think we just need to sit down with the auditors, sit down with Treasury, sit down with people and say, these are the principles that we're working to, now manage us against those principles. Yeah.
Their own batching plant for concrete.
Yeah.
I happen to be involved in the construction of that dam, and also.
Yeah, but then you need the cement. You need the aggregate.
Yes.
You then need the rock drilling specialists.
That's correct.
And so you go on.
Yeah, the work cost, your upfront cost of setting up that plant, but when you look at the benefits, they outweighed, your operating cost, your maintenance cost, as well as your upfront cost, because you had a continuous supply of the material, and the quality was more controlled as well.
Absolutely, there's benefits in everything. So it all comes down to, at the end of the day, even with a public-private partnership, it's all about who can manage risk the best. Because the theory with public-private partnerships and is not always true, is that the private sector can manage risks better than the public sector, so therefore it becomes more economical. But it's not true always. And if we can get the risks taken out, which is the uncertainties in supply, getting a continuous lot of supply, there's a lot of people that want to build, construct, work in government. The people I've met in water and sanitation have spent their whole careers there. They haven't gone off. They just want the thing fixed and get on. I think we've got some very good people in government.
So maybe my last question on the development of the resilient infrastructure. Shouldn't we start looking at updating our building codes also to help lower the carbon emissions? You mentioned that construction contributes about 40% of carbon emissions. And when you look, a lot of research work has been done in the use of sustainable material, but then we don't have building codes that supports that. And,
Yeah, but that's where you've got Ograma. Ograma should be doing that. So, in other words, the assessments, there are methodologies and there are means of achieving it. We do have in South Africa performance-based building regulations, which allow any material, as long as it complies with the performance requirements and is either, if you don't have the codes for it, you go to Ograma in South Africa and do it. That is their primary function. So we've got the mechanisms, but you see, part of the problem with the sustainability or going into different technologies, let me give you this illustration and then you'll understand, is there's also community acceptance. Now, I remember I've worked in international development of international standards, and I had a group of Norwegians that came out here about a decade ago, and with them they had the former head of the Building Research Institute in Norway. And we went to Hammerskral, where the NHBRC has a test village where you can build whatever you like. And Argo came to me and he showed me a house which was a sort of framed and with materials on it that were lightweight. And he said in 1948 in Norway, they built this in an exhibition. The Norwegian builders came and kicked it to pieces and said they would never build with that. Today, that is their common product. Now, I was speaking to the chief director from Department of Education, and because he was asking me about alternative technologies, and I said, you have to get the community acceptance, and I gave him that example. And he looked at me and he said, just the day before, he'd gone to what they regarded as their sort of pilot, shining champion school, precast concrete school that was erected, and he went very proudly there to go and have a look at it, and the headmaster looked at him and said, when are we getting our real structure? You see, it's community acceptance. And this is where we spoke about project value, going and talking to the communities. Like sanitation options and solutions, there's behavioral changes that need to take place right across society from the top to the bottom, all strata. So there's many things that need to be looked at, but they're solvable. Okay, I'll see you then. See you.